if we were all in the same room, what I would do right now is go around quickly and just have people that are willing and interested to just chime in and let me know what your interests are, why you're in this particular workshop, um, what your sort of space and place is. So whether if you're a student and you're studying something, or you're just in a different part of your life, and there's an interest that you have, I'd love to get a sense of what is drawing you to this, so that we can hopefully incorporate some of that stuff into our discussion. So I guess what we'll do is, because we have a relatively big group, why don't we do the old hand raising thing? But also, if that gets clunky and you just want to unmute yourself and say hi and say who you are, that would be fine too. But I think Emma will look for raised hands and let people pop in. So just who you are, what are your interests, why this workshop?
Diana?
Hi, sorry, I don't have a camera on my computer, so
That's
you
all
can
right.
only hear me. So I come from the world of photography, and with COVID, our businesses have changed drastically, and I've just kind of been, I suppose, hit the reset button and try to figure out what else can I do and how to move forward. And so I had this idea of using my background in photography and graphic design to come up with a new type of business where I interview people and actually tell their life stories. And that's actually kind of what led me here. As a friend of mine is actually studying film, and we're doing this together. And then I came in and I saw the class. I was like, oh, this would be perfect. I know nothing about interviewing, and I am planning on doing this going forward. So I thought this would be very useful, actually.
Great. Wonderful. Thank you. Good.
I'm
Hopefully I can
welcome.
give you some places to start from.
Yeah,
Cool.
thank you.
Mhm.
Chloe?
Hi, I'm a current student at William & Mary. I'm majoring in film and media studies and gender, sexuality, and women's studies. I'm not exactly sure where I fit within the film industry or the entertainment industry yet, but I really love talking about people's stories. So I thought it would be interesting to learn about interviewing, because I also am considering being a film critic, and I feel like that would be nice to know how to talk to people.
Awesome. Very cool. Great. Maybe we'll take like two or three more, and then I can roll in, and I'm happy to um, have one-on-one conversations with people afterward as well. But
Tessa?
Hi, my name's Tessa. I'm a sophomore at William & Mary right now. I'm also a film major. And I'm also sort of interested in becoming a film critic, or just like generally being able to write about film. So I'm also really interested in like the interview process and like being able to understand people and listen to them better to tell their stories correctly.
wonderful. Cool.
Artemis?
Hi, I'm Artemis. I'm no longer a student. I actually have my master's degree in creative nonfiction. But I have been obsessed with interviewing for years. I majored in journalism for undergrad a while back, and I just love interviewing. So I would eventually like to help someone with not a documentary, I'm more of a writer. So I'm not as interested in the film side of things, but definitely like memoir and journalism and that sort of thing.
That's where I came
Nice to
from.
meet you.
Nice to meet you as well. So I sort of, my interest in documentary started in creative nonfiction writing too. And then my business partner, had come from the documentary photography world. We met in graduate school where we were both studying journalism, and specifically video journalism. But I've always sort of thought that that's sort of, she kind of came from the visual, and I sort of learned the visual, and I came from more of the puzzle piecing of the text, I guess, and bring that to it. So hopefully that will end up being useful in this conversation too. Yeah.
All right, awesome. So we have, I think, two more.
Okay.
Amanda?
Hello, I'm Amanda. I am a multimedia designer, so I do everything from video to animation and things like that. I'm working on my first documentary about Philippine indigenous groups. So I'm here to kind of, learn more about trying to connect with, different groups of people from different backgrounds and things like that. So thank you so much.
Wonderful. Cool.
And Claire?
Hi there, I'm Claire Seaton. I graduated from William & Mary a couple years ago, and I am a multimedia coordinator at the Pulitzer Center. Had to switch accounts here a little bit. Thanks for your patience on that. But yeah, always interested in, I'm looking to go into video journalism and documentary filmmaking proper from kind of the nonprofit about journalism world. So always looking for, just more tips and tricks on doing good interviews.
Great. Wonderful. Thank you all so much for sharing. I appreciate that. That's really helpful to kind of get, just a little bit of a quick survey of where the different interests are coming from. So that's fantastic. I'm hoping that what will happen today as we talk through is that we'll have a fair amount of opportunity for us to have kind of some quick discussion and answers. Because I'm very aware that I bring my perspective to this work, and that perspective is mine, and it's based on my life experience. It's based on all these different things, and in that way, I'm very happy to share what I have to share, and also I'm aware of the limit of one person's perspective. So I would really love to be able to have that conversation and learn from you all too, from your questions and from your responses. So let me just give you a little bit more of my story of how I came to this work and what that work is, to kind of supplement some of what Emma told you all about me. So it's been about 10 years since Elena, who's my business partner, and I pointed like, that's North Carolina, like 8 states to the south of me. I'm calling you all from Massachusetts. But we started StoryMine right after we graduated from graduate school. So we were in the journalism program at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And we were just both very drawn to documentary video journalism. So really looking at storytelling through the voices of the people who are in the story. So unscripted work. And what we wanted to do was basically take what we saw as the power of that. Documentary has in its best forms, the ability to start conversations and bridge divides, right? We're going to talk a little bit about some of the problems that there are with documentary too, but to begin with, let's talk about it in terms of, our hope of what it does. And we wanted to really be able to kind of take that power of story and connect it to the work that's being done in social change spaces, environmental justice, social justice, the kind of realm of what that work is and what those stories are is huge. It's hard to define it, but really be able to kind of say, so how do we take this work that's being done and attach these strong stories to it in a way that people can learn about the work, or it can further the work that's being done for social change. So what we ended up doing was we started this company where primarily what we're doing is commissioned projects for large nonprofits. They're not always large, but nonprofits all over the country, where we are coming in and doing video strategy with them to really think about like, what is the strength and power of video? How do you take video and use it for what it does best, to be able to help further your cause? And then creating actual video campaigns. So it could be that it's for a donor campaign. It could be that it's about awareness raising. It could be that it's about policy change. It could be that it's about conversation starters, right? It all just sort of depends on what the goal is of the organization. But our goal is always to kind of marry this storytelling and this strategy, and we come to it from the land and the world of documentary, where we're basically trying to say, how do we tell a strong story, and how do we do it in order to communicate and educate about a particular cause, whatever that cause might be. So let me see. I'm going to give you all just like a little bit of a roadmap of what we're going to talk about today, because basically what we're going to do is we're going to talk a little bit about story, what makes a strong story, as I was just talking about. Hold on, let me give you my quick. Nope, that's not it. Hold on a second, guys. Let me pop back up. Just got a little sneak peek. So what makes a good story? What role does the interview play in that? And then we're going to talk about power and responsibility in interviewing and in storytelling, but particularly in interviewing. And then if there's time, we're going to go through preparing for the interview. And I think we're probably not going to have time for the live demo, which is all right. We'll do that next year in person when we're all together again. So I want to start by playing a clip of a story. from the Moth Story Hour. I'm sure you all are probably familiar with it. And I'm not going to play the whole thing because it's a little bit long, but I'm going to give you the setup and then and start you off at where it's logical to start. So this is a story that's told by a man named Charles Upshaw. The story is called Jesse Owens, Michael Phelps, and Me. And so the kind of background is that Charles Upshaw is he's a therapist and he has MS and he's in a wheelchair. So he's telling the story about a new drug that he's learned about when he goes to an appointment with his neurologist that's supposed to help MS patients walk 20% faster. And he's all in. He's like, yeah, I'm interested. I want to know. But in order to qualify for the trial, he has to do a test to see how long it takes him to walk 25 feet so that they can have a baseline of how long does it take him to walk 25 feet before he's on this medication. And then they can compare that later to once he's been on the medication. So that's the setup. And let me get it going for you here. Let me know. I think we're okay on audio, but if it gets screwy for you, just jump in the chat and let us know so we can adjust if possible. Wait a second. Hold on. I don't think I clicked that magical audio button.
Late one Friday afternoon in July, I took my walker to the neurologist's office and started to walk. The first 2 steps were great. I was strong. I was strong like a bull. That 3rd step started to get a little harder. And it got progressively harder the further I walked. By the time I finished, I was out of breath. And I was soaked through with sweat. My shirt was just wringing wet. And I asked the nurse how I did. And she told me. And I said, well, when can I start the medication? She said, Chuck, you can't. And this was the part that the neurologist had neglected to tell me. I had to walk 25 feet within a certain time period. And the time I walked was way, way, way slower than that. Well, this was one of those WTF moments. And I'll admit that I was probably using some of those ugly words. A time frame, it would have been nice if somebody had told me, but nobody did. At that point, I was furious. But I made a decision that I was going to show the insurance companies because they are the ones who had set that time frame. The insurance companies, the man. I was going to show them.
Okay. I'm going to stop it right there. Do you want to know what happens next? Oh, I see some nods. Okay. That's a story. That's a good story, right? So that's instead of just telling us what these were the requirements in order for him to do the study. You could just tell that information. You could share that information without telling a story, right? You could do it by just telling us what the study was. But that's not how he did it. So that's what we're talking about here. How do you tell an interview? How do you use an interview to get to story? That's what we're gonna get to. It should feel frustrating to stop in the middle of something if it's a story. It should feel like I'm halfway there. I don't have what I need to get the rest of it, as opposed to feeling like I'm slogging through whatever this information that's being presented to me is to get to the end of it. That's the difference. That's the story. So I won't leave it there because that seems mean. So I will play you the rest of the story. It's long, so I'm going to give you the big chunk in the middle, and then I'm going to just play the last part. So basically, what he goes on to tell us is that he decides he's going to practice, right? He's going to see if he can get faster, and he decides to do it. So he works on a mental health unit. He's a therapist. So he decides to do it in the hallways of this mental health unit because they are long and it's a place where he feels like he can do it. And as he's doing that, the patients are like, what is he doing? And they decide they want to help him with his goal. So his goal is that he needs to get to under 45 seconds And then he does, kind of midway through, he does do that. And then he sort of realizes that he's kind of addicted to speed. He realizes like, well, if I can get to under 45, like maybe I can go even faster. So he keeps practicing. And that's where we're going to pick it back up. Here we go.
Kept inching down slowly, but she was gone. Okay.
Here we go.
My times kept inching down slowly but surely. And I did get 30 seconds, and my time kept going down. These were my Olympic moments. It was about this time I realized that 25 feet really isn't that far if you have people helping you. The last time I walked was 3 days before I retired. The young woman who was helping me was 19, and she had more attitude than all of you put together. Okay? She started off the same way she did every time I walked. She said, "Ready, Chuck? Walk." And I walked. I walked as fast as I could. When I got to the finish line, she didn't say anything. She looked up at me, but she didn't say anything. Finally, I said, "What's wrong?" She said, "Damn, Chuck." I said, "Walk, not run." She got up, walked slowly over to me, and showed me the stopwatch. 6.7 seconds. Life's a funny old thing. It's full of irony. The first time I walked, I didn't qualify because I was too slow. The last time I walked, I didn't qualify because I was too fast. Jesse Owens, Michael Phelps, and me.
Okay. So, a story is a sequence of actions that culminates in something. A story is a sequence of actions that culminates in something. The thing that it culminates in depends on what the story is. It could be a punchline. It could be light. It could be humorous. It could be a decision. It could be a moment of realization. But the key is that it is a sequence of actions that culminates in something. So the way that Chuck was telling that story, that was not an interview, right? He created this 11-minute thing. He probably wrote it out. He scripted it, right? He knew what that story was, and he created it in a way that it would unfold as he told this story live in the particular setting he was telling it. In documentary work, especially I will say in the type of work that I do, we are not using a script, but we are trying to get those story building blocks. We're trying to get that sequence of actions that culminates in something through the interview. That is what the goal of the interview is. That is the foundation of the story that we're telling. And the way that you do that is it has to do with the questions that you ask. It has to do with the way that you ask them. It has to do with the way you design the interview, and the work you've done before to figure out what that story might be, so you know what questions you're asking to get the pieces that you need to build it out. And I think that's an important note to make, that I think we often think of interviewing as asking a question to get an answer. So I was actually thinking, Emma, when we first logged on, Emma said that her roommate has a job interview right now. And I was like, oh, that's a very different kind of interview, right? Like they are asking a question and the person is answering the question with whatever the correct information is to the question. When we think about interviewing for storytelling, we are looking for, yes, the answers to our questions, but the answers to our questions that give us those building blocks to actually create a story in the end. So let me just give you a quick idea of, I sort of reference it a bit, but when we are doing, before we get to the interview, when we are coming up with what that story might be, how do we do that? What are the steps before we get to actually doing the interview? So when we are working with an organization, we have something that we call the story design process. So basically it's guiding them through really thinking about the goals, the audience, the purpose, diving into kind of the cause and the issue, and through this process, really getting down to like one specific story or anecdote that might exist, that might be the thing that helps communicate the story. So we kind of get to this point where we have what we think of as like a hypothetical storyline. And we get there by having pre-interviews. So before we get to what that actual storyline is, we talk to people to get a sense of what the experience is. And then we can get a sense a bit of what the shared experience is, depending on the topic. And then once we are sort of landed on like, this is the person who has agreed to share their story, we have a pre-interview where we're doing a phone call where we are involving that person in the storytelling process, right? We're sort of trying to say, this is the topic, this is what we're thinking, this is what we're drawn to about what we've heard about your story. What are we missing? What do you know that we don't know? And then we are just having a conversation to hear what their stories are, to ask those questions. Once we have that knowledge, that sort of loose knowledge, we're able to then think, okay, that particular anecdote they told, that's probably going to be really key to us understanding the motivation, to us connecting the audience to them, to us getting at the question that's going to lead us to that sequence that's going to get to the decision point or whatever the outcome is. So that's sort of behind the scenes of the process that gets us up to the interview. I'm going to show you an excerpt of a project that we did where I think this is going to hopefully give you a sense of like how you could do it without story and then how you do it with story, right? So it's a project that we did for the Center for Juvenile Justice Reform, which is at Georgetown University. And it is about Janet Reno, who was she was the Attorney General under Bill Clinton. She was the first female Attorney General. So Georgetown was launching an endowment in her name. And so this was, it was ultimately going to be a fundraising thing, but they wanted it to be something that was the story of her life, specifically about the work that she has done in the juvenile justice and child welfare fields and industry. So what I know about her was I'm a child of the 80s/90s. So I knew that she was really tall and that Will Ferrell had played her on Saturday Night Live. And I knew some of the like headlines from the news that had happened at the time when she was the Attorney General. I did not know that she, a lot of her work prior to being the Attorney General really revolved around child welfare and juvenile justice. And so the people who worked closely with her knew that about her, and they wanted to be able to kind of take that legacy and move that work forward, hopefully. So we were tasked with putting together a short documentary about Janet Reno that really specifically was looking at that. But in that, we still had to kind of like humanize her as a public figure so that the people would feel connected to her. And we had to do that without interviewing her because she's since passed away, but she was in very late stage Parkinson's disease at the time. So she was not going to be able to be interviewed. So we had to figure out how to tell the story of her, career and her work through interviews with other people in a way that made us feel closer to her. So the short clip I'm going to show you right now is our goal was at this moment to kind of tell the story about how she became the Attorney General, but we wanted to do it in a way that made us feel like we knew her or like we got a little bit closer to her. All right, let me pull that one up for you. Hold on. Whoops, hold on. lost where I had it. All right. So this is an interview with Janet Reno's sister. That's who's going to be speaking. You see that here?
Mother was dying when Clinton got elected. There was a feeler from Washington as to whether Janet would be interested in a job in the administration. She said, no, I'm taking care of my mother. Mother died just before Christmas. Jannie had, betwixt all the people coming in and out, finally gotten in and was taking a nap. Mary Doyle called and said, I need to talk to Janet. And I said, you can. She's taking a nap, Mary, and I'm not going to wake her up. She said, well, wake her up and ask her if she wants to be Attorney General of the United States.
She has devoted her life to making her community safer, keeping children out of trouble, and helping families. She has truly put people first.
Any confirmation of a high-level position like this brings anxiety. Will it go smoothly? We all gathered in the office and we watched on TV.
Ms. Reno brings with her a reputation for integrity that's beyond question and a commitment to the principle of justice in its fullest sense.
This was such a significant responsibility for her. What people didn't know at that moment was the gift they were about to receive, which was this woman as Attorney General of the United States, the people's lawyer.
General Reno, congratulations.
The people who work for Janet Reno truly care about her. The feeling is clearly mutual.
I'm going to miss you so much, but you've just got to come to Washington, and I've got to come back here. Thank you.
Okay, so besides baby Joe Biden, which I always get a kick of when I see that now, I'm like, look at that little guy. I want to just walk through what are some of the questions that you ask to get that like step by step of where were you part of that conversation? Bring us to the place of the moment when she was asked, right? So that instead of us just saying Janet Reno became Attorney General of the United States at such and such a date, we can tell a story that tells us something about who she is, and that brings the audience along into that moment so that it feels like they're coming with us through the action. So let me pull up some questions. So when what you're looking for is story, is those sort of nuts and bolts, these are some of the questions that we ask. Tell me about the time when, right? So you're trying to basically get there's a lot of just starting your questions with tell me the story. You're trying to get the interviewee to be a storyteller. Some people just do this. My parents do this. They are the easiest, best interviews I've ever done because you just ask them a question and they answer it in a story. It's fantastic. And when you have an interview like that, that's great. But a lot of times that's not the case. A lot of times people just answer the question. They tell you the answer. They list the things. So one very easy thing you do is you just invite them. Say, tell me the story of when. So tell me about the time when, blah, 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 blah. Tell me about the day when, blah, blah, what was happening? What was going on? Kind of, what was the context of that day? Tell me about the moment when you knew, right? So if it's a decision moment, like, were you always sure about that? Or was there a moment that really became, the decision that you wanted to make became clear? Describe the conversation when. So this can be an internal conversation. Sometimes what you're asking is, in the end, probably now the decision you make feels really clear. Was it always that clear, or was there something going on there as you were kind of working through which way you wanted to go, what you wanted to do? Can you describe that conversation? What was the conversation in your head? In this case, it was great. It was, what was the did you have a conversation with your sister about this? Can you tell me what that conversation was? Tell me about the day when you realized, right? So that's the same idea. That's like, was there a moment? And then the other thing is what were the steps that got you from blank to blank. It could be, what were the steps that got you from being a sophomore at the College of William and Mary to being an Oscar-winning, you know, cinematographer or a film critic, the New York Times film critic? What were those steps? What happened along the way? And you're not going to use all of that, right? But it gets people to start tracing you through what actions that actually happened, and then within those actions, you can kind of start to lift up. Okay, which one of those feel like plot points? Which one of those feel like pivotal moments? And that's how you get those in the interview, is asking those questions. The other thing the interview is important for is emotion. So you have the element of just needing the story blocks. You have the other element, an important thing in story, which is, why do I care, right? Why do I care about the actions that lead to something? I have to care about them because I'm connected to the person by some kind of emotion. I'm connected in some way. And so then you have to think about, what questions are you asking in the interview that's getting at that? That's getting at what it is that's going to make your audience connect or care about the person that's in the story. So when we think about that, the questions that we're asking are, it sort of starts to feel a little bit like a therapy session, but you're asking, like, well, how did that make you feel? When people are telling their own stories, when we think about things retroactively, it feels so obvious and clear that there wasn't any other way to go, that sometimes it takes that moment of sort of like, how did you feel? Were you sure? Did you feel uncertain? And maybe not. Maybe the answer was no, I was certain. I felt great about it. But that's still important. That's still going to be the thing that gets us the emotional connection. If someone says, like, no, I just always knew that's what I wanted to do, the answer is, why? How did you always know that? What does that feel like, to feel like so sure about your path? Another question that we ask to get to emotion is, if the old you could see the new you, what would they say? Right? So that can help people kind of flip that, like, I guess I wasn't always so sure about that thing. I guess I did have that feeling of apprehension before I made that decision. So then you kind of get to, again, this, like, if you had to describe that debate in your head over this moment, what would that be? That often surfaces feelings when you're asking that question. Another you'll hear this on NPR all the time. Another great question is just, what do you make of that? And what you're doing there is you're just basically creating a vacuum and a space, like a very open place for people to then fill in whatever feels like the thing that's important to them about the story. What did you make of that? Why is that story meaningful to you? I mean, that seems like maybe the most obvious question in the world, but ask them, why? Why does it matter to you? Because if it matters to them and you can figure out why it matters to them, then that's going to be pretty key in making it matter to the person that's watching it. Let me see. Are there any other questions I want to? And then this is the sort of the importance of just shutting up, right? It's this idea of, like, not fighting against your instinct as a human to fill the space, and realizing that it's okay. Your interviewee should feel safe, which we're going to talk about in a moment. But it's okay for them to feel a little uncomfortable. There's a difference between those two things, I think. It's okay for there to be that, like, just the uncomfortable that comes with feeling like, I'm going to need a minute to think about how I answer that question. Because usually if there's space and there's silence, it means you're going to get them to tell you something that's different than the way they've said it before. And that can often be pretty key in getting something that kind of moves beyond the soundbite or the generalized answer. So just your job is to listen in those moments and allow them to have a minute to gather their thoughts and figure out what it is that they want to share in order to answer that particular question. So let me see. Let me just show you these are 4 questions that we always ask, and then I'm going to pause for questions in a moment. But 4 questions that we always ask in almost any interview. Tell me about the moment when you realized this was the work you wanted to be doing. It could also be, tell me about the moment when you realized that you cared about this issue. It didn't have to necessarily be specifically about somebody's work. Are there moments from your early life that you can identify as influential in what you're doing now? What changes have you observed in yourself over time? Usually, specifically, we're talking about, like, within the realm of whatever our interview is about. And then as you reflect back on the answers to the previous questions, why is it meaningful to you? Why do you care about it? It's always the question we're asking, why do you care? Because if I don't know why you care, then I'm not going to be able to get the audience to care. Okay, let me just pause and just see if we have what questions, reactions, anything you all want to share at this point. I'll let you do the hand raising thing, or you can also just unmute yourself if there's something you want to pipe in.
We just got a question in the chat
Oh, thank
from
you.
Amanda. How do you know you have a story during the pre-interview process?
That's a good question. So there's a couple different ways. Usually we are looking for anecdotes. So sometimes it has to do with the storyteller. So for us in the pre-interview process, we are typically also sort of trying to choose who we want to interview. So in some cases, it's like we're going to interview this person, period, whether or not they are a strong storyteller. But usually we try to avoid that. We try to have a situation where it's like we're going to pre-interview these 5 people, all of who have relevant experience, life experience or professional experience in this area, and we're going to through that see which one of them either has a particular story that that jumps out, or talks in a way, speaks in a way, shares in a way that is anchored in story. So I think the short answer is we're listening for anecdote, which is a way of that having kind of like the sequence of actions that leads to something, right? So if you ask somebody, why do you care about this? And they say like, there was, I took a class once where the professor said this, and I just remember thinking about blah, blah, blah. And that really changed the way I thought about even that's got pieces of story in it. And that I would feel like, okay, I think I'm going to want to know more about that. It could be that it's something like, we're looking for a perspective shift. So we are working on a project right now that is about climate change, and it's conversations with sort of unlikely climate activists. So if you sort of think about your like archetype caricature of who you imagine a climate activist is, the idea is to try to kind of like depoliticize it and talk to people who aren't usually a part of that conversation. So one of the people we talked to was a climate denier, and had changed their perspective. And this was someone who was like a climate denier as a kid, and he's young still. And he had a moment where he was in an argument with his sisters at the dinner table. And he was talking about why climate change was a hoax, and his sisters sort of tore into him and told them everything that they knew about why that wasn't true. And that was the example that he gave as a moment that there was it began the perspective shift from him. So I think it's to answer your question, a lot of it is like specifics, particularly in terms of like anecdote. Let me see. Let me look at some of these questions. How do you deal with people who ramble off on tangents? Good question. Some of it is that you sort of let them ramble off on tangents, and if you are in a pre-interview, then is that tangent something that's keeping them from being able to actually tell me the story, or is it just part of it? If you have someone that's kind of a talker, sometimes they talk about something that's less relevant, but they also have that same strength when they talk about the thing that is relevant. Great. And I think it's your job to kind of pull them back, but it's also your job to keep it comfortable. So I think you kind of like figure out what that right balance is. If in a pre-interview it's somebody that they're on a tangent and the whole call ends up being a tangent, and you're just like, then we just don't choose them as the person that we're going to interview. How do we to get the interview in the first place? It depends on the project. Usually what happens is we are working with the organization, with people within the community that we're going to be working with, to help kind of surface like who are some people that might be interested in talking and sharing their stories. That's usually how it happens. So it's never a cold call. It's always like a sort of sourced based on people who already know the people, who then can like lead to other people that eventually are say, sure, I'll talk to these people on the phone and see if I'm interested. Let me see.
We have a raised hand.
Yeah.
Taylor.
Hi, I was wondering, you mentioned like the safety and like making the interviewer, making sure they feel comfortable. So how do you balance that with trying to figure out more of the story if there's like some resistance to talking or if there's just like emotional distress regarding what they're talking about?
That's a very good question. And I actually think it's a good transition to the next section that I'm going to talk about. So I'm going to answer that. Well, I don't know if I can say I can answer it, but I'm going to touch on that as I talk about this next thing. So let's talk about power and responsibility. This is what cannot be overstressed, the importance of this in storytelling. And then I'll talk specifically about that, within in this realm of it. So we've talked about story, we've talked about the role of the interview in conveying the story and some of those specific questions that you ask. The next thing has to do with kind of the mood and the tone that you are creating in the space where the interview is happening, and a whole mess of responsibility and power dynamics that comes with that we need to talk about. So I think it's pretty darn common to feel nervous in an interview, right? I feel nervous when I'm the one that's being asked questions. And what that can result in is really canned and rehearsed answers. And usually if that's the case, then your interview doesn't really help you create any connection at all. And it actually maybe creates more distance between the story, so the people that are watching the story and the people that are in the story. So the first step is just to try to help people be comfortable. And that involves just being a human to begin with, right? And involves sort of being able to just like, what is the rapport? Not kind of showing up on the doorstep with your notebook and your pen and have like your Sally reporter hat on and asking all the questions, but having a fair amount of just conversations in advance, whether it's on the pre-interview call, whether it's talking about the logistics, directions, things that you're just able to then talk to them as a human, where you're sharing things about yourself and they're sharing things about them that have nothing to do with the story, but you're just creating a level of comfort so that the atmosphere when you're doing the interview is something where they will feel comfortable talking to you. And yeah, it's really just sort of about that human connection, establishing that kind of one-to-one connection. So then we get to kind of responsibility. There is the moment in almost every interview, in every good interview, I feel like is a strong interview, where I feel like this is going great. I'm getting what I need. They're telling me their story. It's great. We're connecting. And at that same time, I almost simultaneously feel this like pang of guilt in that moment. And what I mean by that is if I can tell that I have succeeded in getting someone to forget about the camera, in my case, it could be the audio recorder, it could be the notes that you're taking, and sort of release the canned, rehearsed responses and just talk to me as a person, then I know that I am getting what I need. I'm getting under the kind of surface and I'm getting into the stuff that makes for a good story. And I also know that I've crossed over into this like territory of like extreme power, right? Because they're not just talking to me. They are talking to the camera. They are talking to the audience that eventually will hear the story, the pieces of the story that I pull from this interview to share. And they're trusting me to tell that story. And they may not be thinking about that in that moment. All they're thinking about that in that moment is she asked me and I'm comfortable. And so I'm talking to her. But I need to be very aware that that's not actually what's happening. And I need to make sure that they are also aware of that. So there can be conflict there, right? So sometimes the thing that's going to make the strongest story might not be the thing that the person would be the most comfortable sharing. Let me give you a quick example. We were interviewing kind of a high-level administrator of a juvenile justice system. So this was in that world that we were doing some work in. And he works with youth in custody. So he has this model that's used across the country, and we were talking to him about that. And he was a really kind man. It was easy to get him to kind of share and be comfortable and kind of drop that like officialness. And we asked one of the questions that we always ask, which is, why is this work meaningful to you? And there was a palpable shift in the interview. And I sort of knew he was about to give us a real answer to that question. And he told us a story of one of his sons who'd gone through a really difficult time with mental illness and had tried to take his own life. And he told us the struggle that he as a father had had to connect with his son and to really understand what he was going through and to help him, and how gut-wrenching that was, and that it really affects the way he views the young men in custody that he works with, and that his model hopefully is helping to improve the experience that they have. And it was exactly the connection that we needed to really humanize him and really show how meaningful that work was. Um, and we had, I'd say, like, there was like the sort of appropriate respectful pause. I said, thank you for sharing that with us, and et cetera. And then we moved on. And a few questions later, he paused and he said, I just don't think I'm really comfortable sharing that story about my son. Because he had had a moment to kind of process, like, I didn't just tell that to Catherine, who I've spent the morning with. I told that to the audience that's going to see this video. And that's a personal story. That's not a story that I want to share. It's not a story I want to decide for my son that I'm going to share. And of course, we were like, absolutely, don't worry. There's none of this like, well, it was on the record, so too bad. Like that's not the way that we choose to do that work anyway. And we assured him that we wouldn't tell the story, and we asked him if there was another way he could, without sharing those details, that he thought he might be able to explain why the work was meaningful for him. And he gave us an answer, and it wasn't as strong, but that's okay, because the real answer is the stories that you're telling are not your stories. They're the stories of the people who are telling the stories in documentary, in the work that I do. That is my line. It's my job to figure out how to create the story through the pieces that I'm getting, but it is not my story. It is their story. And in order to do it ethically, that has to be very clear to the people that you're working with and very clear to you as the storyteller. So I will say that example has always been really meaningful to me. And I think part of it is because, if I'm really being honest with myself, I've sort of viewed it as an example of like my skill of making people feel comfortable. Like, not only was he comfortable enough with me to tell that really personal story, he was comfortable enough with me to say, I don't want to use that in there. And I think I've always relied on that ability. And I feel like I'm a pretty empathetic, well-meaning person. And assumed that I'm not risking causing harm or representing someone's story in a way that's not necessarily, that's not based on my perspective. And that's honestly not enough to just assume that about yourself. There has to be more work being done there. So I'm going to zoom us out a little bit and talk about power and storytelling more broadly. So in the documentary world, there is a long history of documentary storytellers going into Black and Brown communities in particular, and to some extent also poor white communities, and manipulating the stories for the white gaze, for the white audience. And there is a lot of othering that is done in storytelling, that can happen in storytelling, when you are telling the story of a community that you're not a part of to a community that's not a part of the community that the story is being told about. It doesn't mean you cannot do it. It just means that there has to be a lot of examination about how that's done in a way that is really centered in power sharing, and really centered in making sure that you are not telling a story based on your perspective that's not actually representing the story based on the lived experience of the people who are in the story. This is a hugely important topic in this work, and it is not an area that I am an expert in, but it is something that we are thinking about a lot in our work, and thinking about, especially because our work really straddles documentary and philanthropy, and philanthropy and nonprofits have a similarly troubled history of sharing stories of kind of impacted people for the sake of usually like the donor base. And so it cannot be overstated how important it is to really be thinking about that, to be reflecting on that, and to be disrupting it going forward. To that end, I'm going to drop, this is a resource that we put together for a different workshop. So you'll notice some of the stuff at the top is unrelated, but a of just some people, this is not an exhaustive list, that are really paving the way in thinking about this and examining this, that hopefully you all can find useful in the work that you're doing and the stuff that you're thinking about, to think about, to really tap into to what that means. What does that, how do we examine and think about power dynamics in storytelling? Okay, so one more thing, and then I'm going to give us a breath, and we'll move on to some questions. But one of the things that I have found really helpful in that examination of power and thinking about, is this a moment where I'm asking someone to push and tell me something they're uncomfortable with? I think back to, and I lost the thumbnail of who it was that asked the question, so I apologize for not remembering your name. But I think that you have to kind of balance. Sometimes if someone is getting into a space where they're uncomfortable and they're going to tell you something that's really sensitive, it's actually your own feeling of discomfort that's going to stop that. Like we tend to kind of feel like, you don't have to tell me that, it's fine. Like, I don't want to have to deal with it, so you don't have to tell me that. So I think it's important to reflect on whether or not that's the thing that stops it, and also recognize that, like, it's just a conversation, and you communicate it by saying, are you comfortable sharing that? Like, and like, I would love to continue to hear this. I want to make sure you're still comfortable sharing it. Just ask them, like, just have that moment of realizing, this is, and put into place, and I can talk about this later too, it has to do with a little bit of how we're changing and adjusting our process. Touch points. So when I think about that story of the administrator, he was a powerful figure. So he didn't have a problem telling me he didn't want to use it, but that's not always the case, right? So there should be a process built in to say, I'm going to ask you questions. I want you to feel comfortable sharing it with me. I also want you to feel comfortable sharing something and later telling me you don't want to use it because this is your story. So having that be so clear, that trust building is so clear that you can feel more confident that when they are sharing something sensitive with you, that they're okay with it, that they want to. It's their story, and it's their story to share that part too. So I have a very small homework assignment for you all, which is like the easiest homework assignment because I'm not going to ask you to turn it in and you never have to do it. But it is something that I did in graduate school that really affected the way I think about it. So when we tell, in the work that we do, usually our pieces are short. A lot of times they're like 5 or 10 minutes. And we never do an interview that's less than 90 minutes or 2 hours long. So that means I'm taking 2 hours of something and extracting like 3 minutes of what I'm going to use. That's power. Like, that is a lot of power and a lot of responsibility. And so in graduate school, one of my very first video storytelling things that I did was about my brother died of a rare form of colon cancer right after I graduated from William & Mary. He was 27. And years later, I was in grad school for journalism, and I wanted to do a story about losing siblings. And I took the idea to my advisor, and I was like, I'm going to look for someone and interview like 3 people that have experiences like this, blah, blah. And he was like, and then is your story going to be part of it? And I was like, nope, because that's not what I do. I tell other people's stories. I don't want to tell my own. And he nudged me toward really incorporating it. So I did this. The final piece is this 5-minute piece. I don't have time to share it right now, but I'm happy to share it if you'd like to see it later. Where I interviewed 2 other women who had lost siblings, and then I had the person who's now my business partner interview me, and I included my story too. And what that meant was I took a 2-hour interview of myself about a person in my life who is one of the most important people in my life, and whose illness and death, affected me in ways that, I can't imagine telling you in 2 minutes. And I cut it down to 2 minutes. I could have 2 to 3 minutes of quotes to be able to try to explain to you how much I love my brother and how much watching him be sick and die affected me. It was excruciating, and it was a really powerful thing to be able to think, I'm doing this to someone else every time I'm telling a story about something that's meaningful to them. So your homework, it doesn't have to be dramatic. It doesn't have to be a story that's painful. It doesn't have to be, it can be light. It can be humorous. But what I want you to think about doing someday, whether or not you do it right now, is interview yourself, or better yet, come up with questions and have a friend interview you about something that you care about. It could be an issue. It could be like the thing that you study. It could be the work you want to do. It could be, something you observe as an injustice in the world, something. And then I want you to try to boil that down to a 2 to 3 minute story in whatever form, written, whatever. That happened 12 years ago that I did that project. And it is something I really hold on to with almost every project that I do. Every time I pull up a quote from someone's 90-minute interview, I think, is that really taking into account the thing that they said in hour 1 minute and 10 minutes that I'm not including? Like, am I really capturing the story in a way that they would feel like, yep, I know you couldn't include all of it, but that's right. Like, what you have is right. So here we go. And now we're right at the time, but I'm happy to hang out later or longer for more questions. And I didn't get to our nuts and bolts about interviewing, so I can answer some questions about that too. There you go. I feel like a bit of a whirlwind of things to think about as you're interviewing, including some pretty heavy stuff that we only touched on. But I am happy to answer questions. I can take a peek at the chat, or you can also do it by raising your hand. And Emma
Catherine, would you be kind enough to share these slides with us? I wasn't taking notes fast enough, but so much of this was similar to my own work that I was engaged and then realized I was missing the opportunity to take the notes. Would you be kind enough to share your PowerPoint?
I would. You know what? What I'm going to do is I'm going to drop my email address in the chat.
That's very kind of you.
And then if you would just, anybody that wants that, or, feel free if you have other questions just to reach out, and I can share that. I can share other resources or, answer questions too. Good question. So someone asked, getting non-professionals to speak more in sound bites, or at least more complete sentences. So I don't want them to speak in sound bites, even if they're non-professionals. But one trick for complete sentences is something that we call stacking questions. So the style of interviewing that we do, or projects that we do, is you never hear my voice. So it's different than like 20/20 or 60 Minutes, where you see the interviewer and you hear what they say and then you hear the answer, right? So like, the context for the answer. So we have to have the context included. So what we do is sometimes we remind people to kind of answer in complete sentences. Sometimes what we'll do is I'll hear that fragment. So I'm an editor, so I am the one that's also then taking it. So I know when I hear something that I'm like, I'm not gonna be able to use that because they only said half, it was a fragment. So if I hear something that's not quite full enough, I might say, I love what you just said. Could you take me back and could you actually set that up by saying, and I'll give them the first 3 words of the sentence I need them to say, and then have them complete it with what their thought was. The other thing, the sort of question stacking that I just mentioned, is that you'd say like, so I want you to just start off by telling me how old you are and what your name is. So that then they say like, I am 12 and my name is Catherine, as opposed to just, what's your name? Catherine, so you stack the questions, just give them 2 questions on top of each other, and people naturally have to give it to you with a full sentence. Other questions?
I think we had a question a little further up in the chat.
Okay.
From Maureen. Do you have any tips about interviewing children, whether you can just have a conversation or is doing an activity while interviewing a better approach?
Oh, that's such a good question. So we did a project about picky eating, where we were interviewing 2-year-old through 6-year-olds, and I did not have a plan that was good enough for that. And I have, just as context, I currently have a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old, and I still was like, so yes, an activity is great. What we ended up doing after a few failed attempts was having them draw a picture before we started the interview of like foods they thought were yucky and foods they thought were yummy. That's what this topic was about. And then we'd say like, so talk to me about the picture that you drew. What did you draw? And they would explain it. Then we also did, like, we held up different foods and we were like, what face do you make? What does your body tell you when you have to eat this food? And sometimes they would say things that are, they say amazing things when you just look like that. But yes, I do think the other thing that I've done before when interviewing kids is like I was interviewing kids about a teacher that they loved, and one of the questions we asked was like, if you could think of an animal, what kind of animal would Miss Smith be? And they all had answers off the top of their heads. Like it was one of those sort of just like Hail Mary. And it was like a zebra. Obviously, I've thought about this a million times. The answer is a zebra. She's a zebra. So I think that sometimes it's also just like a little bit off the wall questions can be helpful. But I definitely think your idea that you put in the question about activities and getting them to not do sound bites is much more difficult. So I think that you have to kind of think about the approach and the style and whether or not either you're going to need the interviewer's voice in it to make sure that that context works, or what we did with this picky eating thing, is it was 10 interviews or 10 kids. And, you know, when we put them all together, we sliced it together in such a way that it was like so-and-so's, the beginning of so-and-so's comment is what we need to understand the context of the next person's comment is what we need to understand that. So you can kind of be creative about the way you're then formatting it. Two no questions.
So another one from Rachel.
Yeah.
How long do your pre-interviews tend to be? Are they longer or shorter than your in-person interviews?
Hi, Rachel. I know Rachel. Long and probably about, the answer is they are long and usually they are shorter than the actual interview. So if the pre-interview is with someone and we're sort of testing them out to see if they're going to be somebody that's good, we usually know. And so if it's somebody that's not, then it's a shorter interview. Although I will say, usually what we're saying when we're reaching out for those interviews is that we're in the research phase of a project and we're trying to hear the experiences of as many people as possible to help us really develop what this story is going to be. And that's absolutely true. We are doing that. So sometimes even if I'm like, it's not going to be this person, but I'm hearing now, I've now talked to 5 people and I'm hearing similar stories, which is making me feel more confident that this is the story for us to tell. So I let that conversation sometimes go longer, even if I don't think they're going to be the person that we use, because what we're learning from them is still really important. And I don't worry so much about, one of the things people talk about sometimes is that if you do a pre-interview and they tell you the story, then when you do it live, when you do the recorded interview, you're not going to get the same, it's going to be like they've already told you. You're not going to get maybe the same kind of freshness. One way that we fix that is there's 2 of us. So my partner and I, so sometimes we'll do whoever did the pre-interview isn't the one doing the actual interview. So that then you can say like, I know you told Elena this story about such and such. Could you tell me that story too? And sometimes we don't do it that way. And we just say like, you told me this story in the pre-interview. I'd love you to tell me that story again. And if they said something like, well, like I said before, then I just catch that and say, that's great. Can you say that again without saying, like I said before, because we're not going to have that context for the video. Yeah, let me see if I answered your question. And then, yeah, I would say that in-person interviews, I am bad at keeping an interview shorter than 2 hours. I'm really bad at that. Even if I think it should be a 45-minute interview, it's like I just let it go. So I would say a pre-interview is not that long. Usually pre-interviews are an hour, unless the person's just chatty. Because as you can tell, I'm chatty, so a phone call can go long. Okay. Question about how do you suggest students go about their job search if it's in an area they're interested in? For instance, should they look, for instance, for digital producer roles as an entry point to hone their video and storytelling skills, or should they do independent or academic projects to gain experience? Good question. I think the answer is it could be either. And I think it depends a lot on which particular area you're interested in. So if you feel like you want to be a cinematographer, and so you want to just feel like your craft and your skill and your level of expertise in the tool is great, then I would say you should do something that's really going to give you that, right? So it could be that you're being a PA. It could be that because access to the equipment is tricky, but like you can't just like buy that. You could rent it, but it's expensive. So being able to be on the ground floor with an organization that's going to teach you some of that stuff is great. I think I think anything where you can be observing the work of people doing work like what you want to do is going to be valuable, even if it means you're not actually doing the practice of that work in that role. And I think that doing personal stories, personal projects is also incredibly valuable, to be able to like look for an opportunity to just try out and tell whatever thing that you're passionate about, whatever story you're passionate about, to be giving you those practical skills too. That's a kind of a non-answer, because I think it depends a little bit about the specific variables of what you're looking for. But I think the answer is both of those things have value, both of those approaches. All right, after a pre-interview, and I will say, so I'm happy to stay on. Also, if people need to hop off, my email is in the chat. If you have questions, please feel free to reach out. I'm happy to respond and hopefully be helpful. And thank you all really so much for your time. I'm saying goodbye, so you can say goodbye if you'd like to, but if you'd like to hang out, I'll keep answering questions too.
Yeah, thank you, Catherine. We have a lot of time until the next workshop, so feel free to hang on if you want to.
Okay. Let me see. Pre-interview, do you find you have elements you absolutely want them to highlight in the interview? How do you then make sure it appears in the interview? After a pre-interview, I see. Let me reread that question. After a pre-interview, do you find you have elements you absolutely want them to highlight in the interview? How do you make sure it appears in the interview? Yeah, so what happens after the pre-interview is that then we design the interview, which I didn't bring up that screen, but I can if you want. But basically then we are trying to think about, okay, so we know we want this particular story. We know they talked about this anecdote in the pre-interview. So we're going to ask them the questions like what I showed you previously about around that Janet Reno thing, right? So we know we're going to ask Janet Reno's sister about when she became the Attorney General. Here are the questions we're going to ask in order to get that. We may not have asked those questions in the pre-interview. We may have just gotten enough to know like, oh, she was with her when she got that phone call. Let's hear what that story was. And so that's one thing. We're focused on that. The other thing we know we need in the interview is usually some kind of backstory, something that's going to give us the like, you know, who are you? Where'd you come from? Why? What's the before perspective shift in theory? Like, what do we know about this person? So we're asking questions about that. And then we usually have a section that's kind of like reflection questions. That's where we're getting to the like, why is that meaningful to you? So I think, I'm not exactly sure if that answers your question, but the real answer is that you as the interviewer, so if the pre-interview is kind of a conversation with some questions, the interview is much more designed even for you, even if the experience for the interviewee is that it's very conversational. I don't know if that makes sense. So like I go in with a list of questions and I look at them, but because I have like prepped it in such a way that I know what I'm looking for, I can have that conversation, I can have that interview in a conversational tone and still know I'm following what I need to get because I've already thought in my head about it based like from the pre-interview to the interview moment. I have what I think what I think this story is that then I'm going into the interview to capture. So I'm not sure if that answered that question either, but that's sort of how we think about it from a process standpoint. Thank you, Gail, for saying that my chattiness is disarming. I appreciate it. Many characters are well worth getting to know and have things to teach us, but don't live lives that fit into a narrative arc and speak in nuggets. Yep, these stories might not work for supporting or partnering with a nonprofit, but still are worth telling. Thoughts? Yeah, I mean, I think that I am of the school of thought that all stories are worth sharing and that not all people are storytellers. And I think that if they are not storytellers, it doesn't mean their stories aren't important. It's just then comes back to what is the cause and the reason for capturing the story. I think that, you know, oral history, I mean, there's a million different ways to think about why hearing someone's story is important. And the form that you share that story in is maybe the question of whether or not it makes sense to have somebody who just, it's not their cup of tea to explain in a story on camera, then that may not be the best way to capture it. It may be that you should write their story or they should write their story or you should do a photo essay of them. I think there are lots of different ways. And I mean, I think about this with experts. When we have experts that we're interviewing, sometimes everyone's like, you've got to interview this person. I'm like, please tell me there's somebody else who knows about this subject area, because that person is just, he or she, they are brilliant and they can't communicate that well verbally, and they're not going to connect to somebody over the screen. So it's not going to help further the larger cause of what we're working with. But I definitely agree that, I mean, I think all stories are worth telling, and I think that the reason and the audience and the medium and the form all are things you take into consideration about what tool you're using to share those stories.